Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. There is a crisis in our country when it comes to the legal representation of individuals and families in civil cases. These cases are often crucially important. They can involve home foreclosures and evictions, the breakup of families, domestic violence, and many other equally serious matters. It is estimated that 3 out of every 5 people in civil cases go to court without a lawyer. For poor people, not surprisingly, the problems are even worse. 80% of the legal needs of the poor in civil cases go unmet. We'll talk about these widespread challenges and possible solutions with my guest, David Udell, the Executive Director of the National Center for Access to Justice. He's also a visiting professor at the Cardozo School of Law here in New York. Mr. Udell, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming in. I appreciate it. A New York Times story, I think a little over a year ago, said that free legal assistance in non-criminal cases is rare and growing rarer. Can you give us a sense of the scope of this problem?
Sure. We actually prepared what we call a Justice Index at my organization, the National Center for Access to Justice, and you can find it, your viewers can find it online at justiceindex.org. And we do a count of civil legal aid lawyers across the country. And we found that on average, most states have about 1 civil legal aid lawyer per 10,000 poor people in the state. Whereas if you look at the population generally and look at the population of lawyers generally, it's more at the level of 40 per 10,000 people in the general population.
Right.
So that's a fairly startling statistic. I think the other thing to think about is the sheer volume of cases that are in the state court system. I don't think people are aware that if you look at the federal court system, there are about 300,000 cases a year. And the most recent data for the state courts suggests that there are about 20 million new criminal cases a year where there is a right to counsel, and another 23 approximately million civil cases, and then another 50 million traffic cases. And that doesn't count appeals and other kinds of cases as well. So it's really, really vast.
As I mentioned, some of these cases, some of these civil cases are very serious. Can you talk a little bit about what happens and what some of the potential consequences are?
It's true that I think people know from watching television and from just living in our society that if you're incarcerated for a crime,
right,
you're entitled to representation by a lawyer if you cannot afford to pay for one yourself. And but I don't think people realize that if you're about to lose your child in a neglect proceeding to the state, to foster care, many states don't entitle you to counsel in that kind of case. If you're about to lose your home and be homeless on the street, say you lost your job, you haven't been able to keep up with your rent, there's an action being taken to evict you from your home for non-payment of rent, you're not entitled to a lawyer in any state in the country. And if you're involved in, let's say, proceedings to collect child support, you're not entitled to representation by a lawyer. And likewise in domestic violence, where your actual physical safety is at stake, you're not entitled to a lawyer. So I think that the public sometimes doesn't understand this or doesn't pay too close attention to this distinction between civil and criminal cases and the idea of civil legal representation or criminal legal representation. But it's a very, very big deal that in civil cases where the stakes are really in their own way, life and death, that people proceed without representation.
So what typically happens, let's say you can't afford a lawyer, you're facing a neglect proceeding, you might lose custody of a child, or you might be a woman who's the victim of domestic violence, and you need an order of protection, let's say. You could be the victim of wage theft. What typically happens? Do you just show up in court? You don't have a lawyer. You may not know what's going on. What's that scene like?
Well, so you're doing the interview for me. I mean, that is essentially not a good scene. And in many jurisdictions where those would be the facts, you are proceeding alone. And the law is complicated, and so there's a jeopardy posed by not being able to be sophisticated about your rights. In housing cases, it turns out that in most jurisdictions, 90% of the landlords are represented, whereas 90% of the tenants are not represented.
Wow.
So what I would note is that the courts have woken up to this situation and are wanting to make their institutions more responsive to these concerns really, that people don't have lawyers. And so a lot of new things are being tried to help people find their way through, to simplify the complexity of the proceedings and of the institutions, and to find ways to help people. And we could talk more about that if you would like.
If I were in court and I don't know, it's a home foreclosure or an eviction, and it's clear to everybody there, the landlord's attorney, the judge, the staff people in the courtroom, that I'm clueless about defending myself. I don't know what's going on. I don't understand the law. Does somebody just come down with a gavel and say the landlord wins, or does somebody try to walk you through it?
Well, so both things are true depending on where you are and what the resources are. So too often in too many jurisdictions, the history has been that you have essentially a rubber stamping procedure when proceedings are brought against vulnerable individuals. And that really is the sort of core and most troubling problem. What we do see is innovation around the country, particularly at the local governmental level. So in New York City, for example, you have cutting-edge initiatives led by the Human Resources Administration under the de Blasio administration, providing additional funding to support civil legal aid representation and trying to, in New York City, target it to zip codes where the pressure to evict people and the gentrification pressure has been especially intense. There are other, and we do have a civil legal aid bar. As I mentioned earlier, there are not enough civil legal aid lawyers, but
Right.
there are programs that do exist. There's a federally funded initiative called the Legal Services Corporation that spins out funds to these organizations, nonprofit legal services providers across the country. And they do very, very important work in representing a relatively small percentage of the clients, the individuals in court across the country.
Now, your organization is the National Center for Access to Justice. That's at the Cardozo School of Law. Tell us about that. What do you guys try to do?
So we operate at more of a meta level, if you will, trying to develop policies and promote policies that make the courts work better, and also trying to bring data to the process of improving the justice system. One thing that I would mention to your audience is that a friend of mine at the National Center for State Courts has said to me that if you play rotisserie fantasy baseball or football, you can know a batter's average or a pitcher's earned run average up to the last pitch. Whereas if you want to know how many cases are in the state court system, you have to look at data from 2012. You have to do computer runs to find it. And if you really want to know how many people are in the state court system without lawyers at all, you have to start a new initiative to count those cases. And some people are working on that now. So it's problematic that there isn't more data. And at the National Center for Access to Justice, we're trying to support the movement to bring data to the courts and to promote better policies. And so part of what we do is we've developed, as I mentioned earlier, a justice index at justiceindex.org. And we're about to come out with new data toward the end of March. And we track not only, as I mentioned earlier, the count of civil legal aid lawyers serving the poor in all states and compare the states that way, but we also look at other systems in place to help people who won't have lawyers. And so we look at systems to help people who are self-represented, if that's the phrase that's being used now. You could think of them as unrepresented.
Right.
And we also look at systems for people who don't speak English or have limited proficiency in English, and also people with disabilities. Right. And then we rank the states to promote competition, a healthy competition to improve policies in the states.
You mentioned that there is a legal services program, National Legal Services Program, and there are attempts to provide legal services in civil cases to people who can't afford to lawyer, but the need is much greater than the services that are available. So what happens? How is it determined who gets a legal services lawyer? Is it first come, first served? Is it based on the seriousness of the case? How's that determined?
So I can't speak for the individual legal aid programs that do this, although I do have a meta-level sense of the intake procedures that govern. And in general, there's an effort to identify the most urgent, most pressing case, and also an awareness that some people are better able to proceed with advice or assistance and maybe do well enough in their case, even though I think everyone recognizes that it's better to have a lawyer. And so those judgments are made on a daily basis. Sometimes they're made by committee, sometimes they're made by the individual lawyers. And there's an effort to spread the thin resource, but important resource of legal representation to as many people who need it the most, as efficiently as possible.
So there is a reform movement underway.
That's right.
So can you talk about that? I mean, what does reform even look like? What are some of the kind of efforts that are being made?
Well, so at the first level, there's simply an effort to fund the civil legal aid bar that exists, and that's very important. And in every state, there's an effort to help people better understand the importance of civil legal representation and to try to encourage support, not just at the federal level, but also at the state legislative level and also through local and regional government. In addition to that, there's a dynamic civil right to counsel movement. In New York City, it's especially dynamic. There's a very active and exciting coalitional effort. And in addition to that, we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, tremendous innovation by people within the de Blasio administration and the mayor himself to try to bring more resources to legal representation. And then nationally, I would put in a plug for the national map that is online. You can Google it at the Civil Right to Counsel map, and it will pop up, and it will show you the exact status of civil right to counsel efforts in every state across the country. And then in addition to those things, there are all these efforts that are designed to make the courts much more responsive to the concerns of people that don't have lawyers. And as I mentioned, we track some of those and promote them in our Justice Index, and folks can look there to learn more about them. But the chief justices in the state courts across the country have gotten very, very serious about this in the last several years. And Jonathan Littman, the immediately exiting, retiring chief of New York, helped to lead and drive this movement. But the chiefs across the land issued a resolution setting as an aspirational goal 100% effective legal assistance of some kind to individuals who don't have it otherwise. And that resolution is now guiding reform efforts across the states. And so to give one example, there are a few examples I'll give. One example is that we tend to think of judges as passive referees in cases. And certainly they shouldn't prejudge the merits of a case or be biased in favor of one side over the other. But the United States Supreme Court said, you know, until we can have a lawyer in every case for every individual who needs it, we're going to have to look to the judges to make sure that people understand what the issue is in the case that they could win or lose on. And we're going to have to make sure that they understand what evidentiary material is necessary to put into the record in order for there to be a ruling on the merits that's fair. And so that, along with efforts in all the states to modify the codes of judicial conduct to make clear that it's not a violation of a judge's professional responsibility. It's not biased if the judge just makes sure that someone who is unrepresented has a fair proceeding in court. That is moving across the land, and it's something that we track and promote in our Justice Index as well.
Now, the situation can sometimes seem so extreme. I mean, besides not understanding the law, I mean, you go into a courthouse or a courtroom, it can be so intimidating, even for people who show up with a lawyer. So it would seem to me that if you're not represented, that almost any help would be worthwhile. So I'm thinking, I think you mentioned paralegals, but I'm thinking about law students or other folks who are not technically lawyers who could provide legal assistance. Is there an effort to do that? Does that happen? Are there roadblocks to that sort of thing?
So I think this is one of the most fascinating areas, partly because of the innovation that's occurring, and partly because the issues that have prevented innovation from occurring over the years are close calls in a way. You know, on the one hand, we don't want to have a society in which there's one standard of legal assistance for people with money and another standard that doesn't require lawyers for people without money. And also, we have to keep in mind that responsible people and the bar itself want to make sure that if people are going to get legal assistance, it has to be smart, sensible, accurate legal assistance. So those concerns over the years have made it a slow process to think about, you know, should there be a way to help people that aren't going to have any kind of help? And if you think about it, there are three positions. You could provide no help at all to people who urgently need help. You could provide some help to some of those people, or you could provide lawyers to those people. And the choice is often between no help and some help. So that's sort of at a broad level of just how to think about it. But then I think that, and I'm a big supporter of providing lawyers to people who need lawyers, and I wouldn't suggest that it's necessarily better or acceptable to have less. But I do think that in some instances it can be important, and experiments are occurring now to see what can non-lawyers do for people. And we also shouldn't turn a blind eye to the sheer fact that across the land you have lots of non-lawyers who are providing different kinds of legal assistance to people. You have social workers who work in hospitals who are helping people understand their court opinions and court forms. You have outreach workers that are helping people on the street, or psychiatric care workers. And so a lot of that is happening, and certainly paralegals do a lot of work under the supervision of lawyers and are allowed, with even outside of the supervision of lawyers, to help many people in administrative cases, for example, in Social Security, administrative disability benefits claims. And so in New York, there's an interesting experiment with navigators, that's the term that's being used, who are not lawyers, but who have been placed into courts to provide moral and organizational support to individuals. And so that is an experiment that's being studied now in a very serious way.
What would a navigator do, and what would constitute moral support? I mean,
well, what happens, and you pointed out to this earlier, or I think you did, that the courts can be very intimidating places. Right. And if you have someone who has been brought into a housing court and has a stack of papers and doesn't understand really what the content of those papers is, and is facing questions from a judge, it can be extremely helpful to have a person who is thoughtful and sophisticated, who has learned about these cases and learned about the kinds of questions that come up, to be there side by side with the tenant, if you will, or a debtor, if you will, and to be able to answer questions and explain this is what the judge is asking and this is what's needed from you. It may seem very, very modest, and it may turn out to be modest, not sufficient to be that helpful, but the early signs, a snapshot study that was done by the New York court system last fall, show that it does make a big difference, and that the people experiencing it think it makes a big difference. If you look at the papers themselves, it shows that more defenses were raised in some cases as a result of more information coming out. And so that is something that people are excited about. That's among the more modest of the innovations. I don't know how much time we have, but I'd say in Washington State, there's something called limited licensed legal technicians. And in New York, there's an idea that has been supported by the courts and by the state bar to develop what would be called housing court advocates, who would work under the supervision of an attorney, but who would be able to go into court and to point out evidence and arguments that could make a potentially dispositive difference in the case. So these things are all happening, and I think it's an exciting time. And I think that the innovations have been handled in a very responsible way, and it'll be very interesting to see how they go forward.
It sounds like when the need is so great that if you came close to meeting that need, it would take a terrific amount of money, just tons of money. Is there anything like that kind of money available from any sources?
I think the most accurate and most responsible way to talk about the money need is to point out first that this isn't a situation where you would say, well, everyone in every kind of matter has to have a lawyer. I think that responsible people in the courts and in the public are looking carefully to see how can we think about who really needs to have a lawyer and where will it make the most and greatest difference. And I think what the de Blasio administration done has been financially very prudent and practical in targeting zip codes where it's clear that many people are being pushed out of their apartments because they don't have legal representation. So, but in addition to that, work has been done by the New York court system and by economists to look carefully at, so what are the financial impacts, what are the savings when you do provide legal representation to people? And those studies have been, I think, counterintuitive in the result and very surprising, and they show very substantial savings, including, for example, to the shelter system and to the public fisc when you do make the initial outlay of money to provide lawyers.
That actually doesn't seem counterintuitive to me. It seems pretty logical that if you had people who were properly represented, well, I'll put it a different way, that it would be penny wise and pound foolish not to have people properly represented in court. Because if you're going to be evicted, or if you're just going to be a victim of wage theft and you have no recourse, or if you have women who cannot escape abusive partners and that sort of thing, that they go to social services. I mean, whether it's a homeless shelter, or whether it's a battered women's shelter, or whether it's somebody who needs food stamps for the family because they're not being properly paid. It just seems to me that if they were properly represented, that there would be a net savings overall.
I think there is, and I think the studies that have been done to date show that. I mean, other things to keep in mind are that when a lawyer with knowledge of the law is involved in the case, that often leads to the discovery that, in fact, there isn't a case to be brought or a case to be defended. And so the lawyer really saves time for everyone involved by figuring out the shortest path to the inevitable resolution. Likewise, judges do not especially like to have cases appear in front of them where there isn't a lawyer on both sides. I think it's especially difficult for judges where there's a lawyer on one side and not on the other side. And so for them too, instead of spending all that time sorting through everything, it's been shown to be advantageous to them to have counsel in the cases.
Now, in the wake of the Great Recession, where many services were being cut, funding for many services were being cut, funding was being cut also for legal services in this country. Has that eased, or what's the state of funding now? Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it flat?
So as I think everyone knows, the scene at the federal level on all legislation has been relatively frozen, and legal services has had steady support at the level that it has been at, but has not had the infusion of funds that's necessary to bring it back to the level that it should be. It's well down from its sort of average. I think it's now in the $250 to $300 million level at the federal appropriations, which is far below what I think in inflation-adjusted dollars would have been much higher, up at the 700 or 800 or even higher level historically. And at the same time that inequality in the society has increased and that poverty has increased. Right. And so everyone is very troubled by that. Now, there has been some additional funding coming, as I mentioned earlier, coming in through state and local government, through individual donors. There's foundations involved. There are law firms that provide support. But the backbone of our legal representation system for the poor, working poor in the United States, has been the Legal Services Corporation, and it does need more money.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, David Udell. We'll be back in a moment with a final word. Donald Trump wants to send 20,000 to 30,000 American ground troops into the Middle East to fight ISIS. We have no choice, he says. Really? Has Mr. Trump already forgotten our long, tragic experience in Afghanistan and the catastrophic war we fought in Iraq? And who would fight this new war? Since Trump has not called for a reinstatement of the draft, I can only assume that the warriors would come from the same pool that supplied the soldiers and Marines for Afghanistan and Iraq. Those troops amounted to less than 1% of the U.S. population. There were so few of them that they had to be sent into the combat zone for 3, 4, and sometimes 5 or more tours. Most Americans wouldn't even consider allowing their children to go off and fight in a war. Wars are something to be fought by other people's children. I'm a veteran of the United States Army, and I am disgusted by people, including presidential candidates, who are quick to say that we should go to war, but are unwilling to fight themselves or to let their children put on a military uniform and fight. The closest most of these folks get to the reality of warfare is waving a flag at a ball game or pasting a bumper sticker on their car. That's not patriotism, it's cowardice. That's all for now. See you next time.